This hearing of the Subcommittee on Government Organization, Efficiency, and Financial Management will come to order. First, I want to apologize to my colleagues, our witness, and others for the delay in starting. Typically have about an hour and 45-minute commute. And today was about 2:40, maybe 2:45, and thankfully, hope all the individuals who were in the accidents that I passed are safe, and glad I was not in them, but apologize for keeping you waiting. But we are glad to be here today for this important oversight hearing. I want to thank our witness for being here today to discuss efforts to collect delinquent debt owed to the Federal Government. While this is certainly a financial management issue, it also is an accountability issue. Part of accountability is making sure that people fulfill their obligations, whether those obligations are to pay a fine, a penalty, or to repay a Federal loan, or to pay child support. Each and every day, the people of Treasury's Debt Management Service do all they can to demand accountability while being sensitive to the rights and circumstances of debtors. This hearing coincides with the release of the fiscal year 2010 Annual Debt Report, which provides a detailed look at Treasury's activities. We look forward to discussing that report as well as some of the proposals in the President's budget. We are honored here today to have Mr. David Lebryk with us. Commissioner Lebryk is Commissioner of the United States Department of the Treasury's Financial Management Service. As Commissioner, he provides leadership, policy direction, and guidance for financial management programs, including payments, collections, debt collection, and government-wide accounting and financial reporting. Commissioner Lebryk, I appreciate you submitting your written testimony here today, and have had a chance to review that as well as the report, and also appreciated your reference to our joint predecessor for former Chairman Towns and myself in referencing Chairman Horn. It was quite an honor to serve with him when I first came to Congress in 2000, and he was a great leader of this subcommittee as well as on a number of efforts, as you referenced in your statement. As the author of the Debt Collection Improvement Act, Chairman Horn certainly worked tirelessly on this issue that we are going to talk about here today, and certainly honored to follow in his footsteps and continuing his efforts in partnering with you and my colleagues. Also want to thank you for your service in general. As one who believes in the ideals of public service, appreciate what you give back to our country and our fellow citizens. Ranking Member and I look forward to working with you along with our subcommittee colleagues and being partners in this important effort achieving accountability for the American people. Now recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Towns from New York, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for arranging this hearing. As this Congress continues to debate the nation's budget, we are looking to identify sensible cost-cutting measures and ways to increase revenue to the Federal Government. This hearing considers the collection of debt owed to the government, which is an important revenue stream in these tough economic times. I thank the Chairman for holding this hearing. Collection of Federal Government and State debt is an essential way to help fund government operations, maintain key programs, and help reduce the Federal deficit. It is also an extremely effective method of collecting delinquent child support obligations to help meet the needs of the children who depend on that support. In the years since this subcommittee began examining debt collection, there has been great improvement. The Treasury Department has taken the tools that the Congress provided in the Debt Collection Improvement Act of 1996 and has expanded its reach to increase the volume of delinquent debt in the government recoups. From 1996 to the end of FY 2010, Financial Management Services has collected more than $49.7 billion for Federal and State agencies. This is a commendable result compared to the collection level before 1996. Treasury continues to improve its offset and cross-servicing programs. FMS has ramped up its efforts in collecting delinquent tax and non-tax debt owed by Federal employees. The doctors and hospitals who receive Medicare payments and Federal contractors, they are working on identifying other payments that the government can target for collection. There is more than $625 billion in outstanding debts to the government. We are actively collecting $422 billion of that balance. In FY 2010, we actually recovered $5.3 billion. It is clear, Mr. Chairman, that there is much more work that needs to be done. And I am looking forward to the testimony today of our witness. And, of course, as a result of this, I hope we can continue to move forward as we have done over the last few years. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time. I am anxious and eager to hear from our witness.
Thank you, Mr. Towns. We'll now proceed to Commissioner lebryk. And, Commissioner, as the kind of the practice and rules of the House, we swear in every witness. So if I could ask you to stand and raise your right hand. Do solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. So the clerk will note that the witness answered in the affirmative, and would like you to proceed. We have 7 minutes on the clock, but if you need a little more as the only witness, we're certainly glad to give you some additional time.
I'll try to stay within that time frame. Chairman, thank you. Chairman Platts, Ranking Member Towns, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on something which we take very seriously, and that's the collection of delinquent debt owed to the Federal Government. I ask that my entire statement be read into the record. Thank you. Congressman Horn was a tremendous champion of the Debt Collection Improvement Act in 1996, and so I wanted to spend a moment and pay our respects to him for the efforts that he did. We had a lot of spirited conversations with Chairman Horn during those early years, and we all shared a very common objective, and that was to make sure we were doing the best interest of the American taxpayer. He was really quite a champion of this act and the work that we are doing at FMS, and we are very much appreciative of that. This marks the 15th anniversary of the Debt Collection Improvement Act, and a lot has been accomplished in that time. I want to thank you again for holding this hearing to demonstrate Congress's interest in the Federal Government's activities. I also want to commend the leadership of you, Chairman Platts and Mr. Towns, for your interest in our operations. We look forward to that continued partnership and working together to improve the things that we do. We are proud of the role that we play in providing this essential service to the Federal Government and to the citizens that we serve. We take that responsibility quite seriously, and we place a great deal of importance on demonstrating value to the American public and carrying out our responsibilities. FMS collects delinquent debt on behalf of Federal and State agencies in accordance with the Debt Collection Improvement Act and other applicable laws. We embrace the goals of the DCIA to maximize collections while minimizing the costs to the government in that effort. We carry out the statutory responsibilities effectively and efficiently with seriousness of purpose. Collecting debt is part of our core mission. I think we are one of the few government agencies that has, if maybe the only agency that has debt collection as part of its core mission. We are constantly looking for ways to improve our activity, our efforts, and the centralization of collection of debt owed to the Federal Government. And I will go into a little bit later some of those efforts that we have ongoing right now to do even better than what we have been doing in the past. The DCIA requires agencies to refer most of their debts to FMS with 180 days of delinquency. We encourage agencies to refer debts to us sooner. We have 2 major mechanisms with which we collect the debt. One is something called the Treasury Offset Program, which is effectively a means of matching Federal payments against delinquent debt files. So it is a highly automated, highly efficient process, the premise being that we shouldn't be making payments to someone who owes debt to the Federal Government, and the attempt is to intercept those payments before they are actually made. And as I mentioned, that's a highly efficient mechanism. The second mechanism that we use is called cross-servicing, and that's more actively working the debts. We do things like write letters to debtors. We refer debts to private collection agencies. We refer debts to the Department of Justice for litigation. We use administrative wage garnishment to attach the wages of working debtors, and we report debts to credit bureaus. While we strive to collect the maximum number of dollars possible, we are also aware of the needs of the debtors to be treated fairly. We are mindful that not every debtor is financially able to repay their debts, and debtors are provided the appropriate due process rights allowed to repay debts over time. We take great care to protect the privacy rights of individuals and have robust measures in place to guard the security and sensitivity of financial and private data. Also, part of our very core mission and our values within our organization is that we treat debtors as we would like to be treated ourselves, and that's something that permeates all of our workers in the process of their efforts. We recognize that we have to be serious and tough at times, but we also realize we need to treat people respectfully and as we would like to be treated ourselves. Since 1996, FMS has collected more than $47.9 billion on behalf of the Federal and State agencies. We've collected $5.4 billion in delinquent debt in 2010, including $2.1 billion in delinquent child support. And in fact, that child support is something that, while we're quite pleased to help the Federal agencies in the United States government, it does give us some sense of strong purpose of what we do is important and adds value to the American families and children. We are also on track this year to increase our collections over last year. We're ahead at this point. We're approximately 8% ahead of where we were last year at the same time and with respect to our collections. We expect to continue growth in the coming years, and we have a 7-point strategy plan in order to increase those collections, which I'd like to get into a little bit later, and we expect a strong period of sustained growth. We also have a couple of legislative proposals in place, which in totality will bring an additional $5 billion in collections to the Federal Government over the course of the next 10 years. One key area of delinquent debt I know oftentimes of interest is Federal debt owed by Federal employees. And since the passage of the Debt Collection Improvement Act, FMS has collected $340 million from Federal employees, including $277 million in delinquent tax debt. In 2010, FMS collected $85 million from delinquent Federal employees, an increase of 6.5% from 2009. The second area which has received a fair amount of attention recently is Medicare payments. FMS intercepts Medicare payments to doctors, hospitals, and other providers who owe delinquent debts and delinquent tax and non-tax debts. Since 2008, FMS has collected $136 million from payments to Medicare providers who owe delinquent debts, including $107 million in tax debts. A third area that we've been increasing our efforts is debts owed to states. And we have the ability to help states who I think are very much in need right now of revenues. So we use the Treasury Offset Program as a way to collect funds on behalf of states. Most recently, Kentucky just joined the program, and in the first week of the program, they collected close to $2 million. In the first month, they collected $4.7 million through the State Reciprocal Program. We also most recently, based on legislation passed by Congress, are working to collect state unemployment compensation debts, where there's either been overpayments or fraud in the unemployment program. New York was one of the first programs to sign on to the program recently, and the first 2 days of the program collected $2.8 million. Wisconsin was the second state to sign on and collected $640,000 in its first day. So we see a lot of opportunity to help states and assist states in fulfilling and getting repayment for either overpayments or fraud in various programs that are out there. I mentioned the 7-point strategy that we have at FMS to increase collections over the course of the coming years. Those strategies, I think, include increasing our call center capability. Last year, we handled 4.3 million calls from debtors trying to resolve debts. We're implementing state-of-the-art collection tools. We're increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of our debt collection processes. And we're also reaching out and establishing agency council, which we can work with our sister agencies to improve and look at best practices and sharing of more information to improve government-wide collections. With that, I see I've just hit exactly 7 minutes, so I'll end where I started to once again thank you for allowing me to testify in front of you. I want to emphasize again that we are very proud of the role that we play in providing essential services to the people and to the Federal Government. And we place great importance on demonstrating value to the American people and fulfilling these responsibilities. And we very much look forward to working with this committee to fulfill those responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate your testimony as well as, again, your written information you provided. I'll start with a couple of questions myself. You know, in fact, rather than starting myself, I'm going to, because of being the one that was last in the room, I'm going to go to my ranking member first, and then to my colleagues who've been very patient, and I'm going to go last, actually. So, Ms. Towns, if you're ready, I'll yield to you for the purpose of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, but you don't have to punish yourself for being last. But let me, why is it that the government, after 2 years, delinquent debt is sort of, you stop pursuing it. In the private sector, it's 7 or 9, I think it's 7 years. So, I mean, why would they be able to pursue it much longer than the government?
Well, in many cases, the government, for example, on student loan debt, it does not ever get extinguished. So the capability exists for the Federal Government to continue to pursue that debt really through the life of a debtor. And as a result, we often talk about if we're not able to collect that debt during the working years, that as one reaches Social Security, we have the ability to offset Social Security payments up to a certain level to continue to collect on those debts. So those debts stay on the books for a long time. There are some debts that are actually, and there's maybe some distinction here. The Federal Government will write a debt off, and that's really an accounting entity. It basically, in accounting purposes, you're required as an entity to say what's the fair value of an asset or a liability on your books. It doesn't mean that we stop collecting the debt. Okay, so there's a distinction there, which is you can write something off and show on your books that it has a value of, let's say, 10 cents on the dollar. On the other hand, we as a Federal Government will continue to collect on that debt and hopefully collect 100 cents on the dollar unless it has been written off entirely as not collectible. So a fairly small percentage of the numbers. So if you look at the numbers, I think that's roughly $25 billion has been written off, but only about $4.5 billion has been considered not collectible and truly extinguished as no longer being pursued for debt collection purposes. And that's usually something that someone's been in bankruptcy and is no longer, the entity no longer exists, and therefore is not being collected against.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I understand that direct and guaranteed loans account for most of the delinquency. At the Education Department, the SBA, and the USDA. These loans are no doubt necessary because they are often made when private sector, of course, credit is unavailable or maybe inadequate. And a Federal objective needs to be achieved. I understand that. You know, for example, some education loans, small business loans, and support for farmers. But what I don't understand is, and maybe you can explain to me, the type of debt that is owed to Social Security Administration and the Department of Defense. I don't understand why we'd have loans there.
The Social Security debt is really about overpayments. And so it's about improper payments and overpayments. And so what ends up happening is Social Security will work those improper payments up to a point. When they no longer have a sense that they can collect it up to that point, they will refer it to us and it becomes a delinquent debt. So there are situations where, particularly in the SSI program, I think which is income-based, there are situations where someone will have some income which will push them out of eligibility, but still, nevertheless, the payment has been made. And so SSA will go back and try to retrieve that overpayment. And if they can't, then it ends up in a delinquent debt portfolio.
What about the Department of Defense?
I'm less familiar with the delinquencies that are in DOD. I wonder whether I'm conjecture here. I wonder whether they're contract debts. I'm just not sure. Or they perhaps could be overpayments in some of the medical programs too. But I can look into that more fully for you.
Right. We do that and
Yes.
get back to us on it because I could understand the others, but those two, and now that you explained the Social Security one, are there a lot of overpayment situations?
You know,
Social Security?
I think every day 3,000 people pass away. And as a result of that, Social Security has to have systems which looks at, you know, if you've been making a payment to someone for, you know, years on end, they're required to get that information, and to stop those, you're required to report that information immediately. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And there are various databases which they try to call to see whether there's, you know, they've actually captured that payment that shouldn't be made. But it's not a perfect process. And so I think those, and also in the case of SSI, where the rules can sometimes be confusing about eligibility and non-eligibility, you can have situations where there's the overpayments.
Right. Who's sort of responsible for notifying Social Security that the person has expired? What's the process?
It is the family that's required to report it immediately to Social Security.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Towns. Mr. Ginta?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and thank you, Commissioner lebryk, for being here. I have a few specific areas of concern. First of all, could you just let me know what area for FMS provides the most challenge the greatest challenge in terms of debt collection? Is there any one area that is more difficult than another?
The Debt Collection Improvement Act has been enormously successful in getting agencies to participate. In the early years, and some of the hearings we had with Chairman Horn at that time, was really getting tough on the agencies because they weren't referring debts to us. I think that process has really, we've had a success there in terms of agencies now referring debts to us for the most part at the 180 days. We also, some of the early years, had challenges getting all the payment streams in. So DOD makes payments and the Postal Service makes payments, and we had some challenges making sure those payment streams are being offset. And that process now, I think, is working very, very well. I wouldn't necessarily point in any one particular area except to say that I think that we're not as sophisticated in the government as we should be with respect to how we're looking at delinquent debt. The private sector is much further along than we are right now in looking at how you work debts in the portfolio. So when I mentioned the 7 strategies earlier about where FMS thinks that we need to go, we need to do a better job of analyzing the debts and which debts are more collectible, a better job of, which is debt scoring, a better job of making sure when we have partial information that we have the capability of cleaning that information up in an automated fashion. I think that there are other practices that the agencies could be doing, which we need to be working with them on the pre-180 day about how do you interact with a debtor.
Well, that's right now, you don't see it until 180 days. How come you wouldn't, what would be the agency process for the mechanism at 60 or 90 days?
They would have their own internal processes, and I think to answer your first question, I think that there is a lot of opportunity for agencies to be more scientific and disciplined in what they're doing pre-180. And part of it, what I would say, this gets to I think the value of the DCIA and centralization is, we think about this every day. That's our job. We think about debt collection practices and how you're going to manage your debt portfolio. I don't necessarily think that it's probably as widespread across government that that's their core mission. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do a better job on that in that pre-180. And as for obvious purposes, the sooner you try to collect the debt, the better chances you have of collecting it.
And then when you write off, does it vary when you're going to write that debt off based on your assessment of the likelihood of collection, or is it just at a date and certain you're essentially writing it off?
OMB encourages agencies to write off debts at 2 years. And as I mentioned, though, and there's a distinction there, which is writing off is different than stopping collection activity. So really those that are being really written off, and sort of what our sense of the word written off means, is a fairly small percentage, and that's usually in the case of either bankruptcy or the entity doesn't exist anymore and you can't really go after anything anymore.
But that's happening at roughly at the 2-year mark for that uncollectible written-off debt?
I don't know this for certain, but my guess is if you really went back and looked at it, it's probably happening further out than 2 years, that agencies are continuing to hold these things for a long period of time and really doing everything that they can, and really probably in a much longer period of time are actually making that assessments, unless they know for a fact that the entity no longer exists or the person doesn't exist.
And then do you have data on a 1-year, 2-year, 3-year, 4-year debt and the ratios at which you're collecting and the costs it's for us and for the agency for that collection at those different periods?
One of the 7 strategies is for us to have better analytical capability in looking at the debts, and we have some rough information about that, but not information that gives me a lot of confidence that I can say that this is the percentage that we're doing at 180 to 360. I think we need to do more work in that area, and that's one of the areas that we're applying more resources with FMS to really help agencies understand that better.
I think it would be fair to say that if we could improve the collection rate anywhere between the 60 to 360, we'd probably have a greater percentage of debt collected, and you'd have obviously a lower write-off.
Correct.
And obviously you're spending the best, or you're maximizing our resources at the earlier period. So anything that can be done to improve that and allow agencies, whether it's educating agencies or whether it's an oversight issue for us, I mean, please feel free to convey that so we can give you the tools that you need to improve in those particular areas. Thank you.
We have looked at private sector experience in this area on consumer debt, which is a little bit different than some of the debt that we have. And your assessment's absolutely right that When you're working that debt in that 60, 90 to 180-day period, you have a much higher chance of collectability than when you're working that debt in the 2-year or the 3-year time frame. So I think that's something that we've been talking to the agencies about, is whether there's instances where they should be referring it to us sooner for that reason.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ginta. Dr. Gosar?
Yes, thank you. I kind of want to go back to what you said to my colleague, Mr. Ginta. And the cross-servicing program is used by agencies required to report that delinquent debt to the Treasury for recovery efforts. In FY 2010, Treasury was able to recover roughly about $123 million out of $107 billion. Can you tell me why that's so low? I mean, we're talking about a penny on the dollar.
Yeah. I mentioned the 2 programs that we have, and one is the offset, the automated offset. So that full amount that you referenced, 107, is actually being hit against offset, the payment streams, and that's where you're getting a high bulk of that $5.4 billion that we collected. For a variety of reasons, we don't use cross-servicing on the full amount, and part of that is there are a number of exemptions that apply that don't allow us to do cross-servicing on all the debts that are referred to us, and that is the active working of those debts. And so there are a variety of exemptions that include bankruptcy, forbearance, debt in litigation. There's also an important category that while you that number of 104 there's approximately $36 billion of it which is being cross-serviced at education and HHS. So while the number I'm going to tell you is that we're only working at cross-servicing on that portfolio around $14 billion, it's gone up a little bit in the last couple of months, now closer to 16. Education is working $36 billion of that through their cross-servicing mechanisms that they have on student debt portfolio. They collected last year close to $600 million on that portfolio. So there's another number that's there. Second thing which I would say is that we only report what we captured in cash. And so one of the things that we're on our cross-servicing program is administrative wage garnishment. So when you look at administrative wage garnishment and repayment agreements, there's roughly another $500 million that we have in the pipeline that we're getting bits at a time, whether they be payments that are being done on a monthly basis or along the way from a debtor. So there's some success there. And the final reason is the nature of Federal debt. It's not great debt. And we're oftentimes the last resort of people getting loans that they can't get someplace else. So the collectability on that portfolio is much lower than it would be if you had a better quality of debt. For example, consumer debt in many ways has a higher collectability than much of the debt that we have given the nature of our debtors.
Isn't there a way that we could report that then? I mean, it seems to me like you want to itemize this. If I'm looking at delinquencies, I want to look at, if I've got a payment plan, shouldn't I have a number that I'm looking at that are in payment in lieu that are up to standard? And that gives me another parameter, because if I've got payments coming in lieu of, then I don't have to spend as much time into that area. It's just a maintenance type issue. Then I can concentrate my efforts more into the other areas of the problem. And it seems to me like the advantage would be to share all this information start to finish, not at 180 days. Am I right?
The sharing the information with respect to
all debt.
Yeah.
It should be, interagency should be, this should be real time watching this, and it's no different than the private sector is looking at this, categorically across the business.
Yes.
What's it coming from this area, this and there, and this area, and we can concentrate it. Many hands make light work.
Yes. And that's one of the reasons when we go through our 7 strategies in terms of analytical tools, this is some area which I think there's a lot of work that can be done within the Federal Government that we're pursuing, and that is looking at that portfolio and saying which debt has a greater likelihood of collectability than another debt. And also I think a very important set of tools that we have in place right now, what we're putting in place right now, is we have something called partial matches. If a debt comes in that says John Q. Public that lives on Main Street, and the payment file says John S. Public on Main Street, we kick that debt out because we're not 100% sure it's the same person. We now have more automated tools in which we can say John Q. and John S. living at the same address are probably the same person. So we should be doing that offset rather than what we're doing right now is returning that debt to the agency and saying you need to clean it up. And so the centralized value of that is that we FMS can be doing a better job of that in the front end. Last year, there were close to 150,000 partial matches. We're estimating that if we were able to clean those partial matches up, that we would have $100 to $200 million more in collections simply by doing that. And so this is my point about us being smarter and more analytic and using more modern tools to do the things about segmenting that portfolio and working it in a more disciplined way.
Yeah, one more question. When I'm looking at your chart in regards to delinquent collections, particularly of the $47.9 billion, you're collecting 48% of that is delinquent child support. How much of that has actually been in dialogue with law enforcement? Support with law enforcement? Because I know in Arizona it's huge. I mean, that's where we're getting a lot of delinquent child support being picked up.
Yes. We do the child support program on behalf of the states. And so the child support obligations that we're collecting for are state obligations. And so with respect to when the state or the locality is working with local law enforcement, it would be done at that level rather than at the Federal level.
Okay. One last carryover. Sorry about that. Okay. Do you prioritize each of these debts? Like, in the private sector, we look at low-hanging fruit, what's the hardest to get. Do you prioritize, and which one do you find easiest, which do you find the worst?
And the answer, right now, we treat all debts equally, which is not the right answer.
There you go.
Okay. What we really need to be doing right now is looking at that portfolio more systematically and strategically and saying, what is the low-hanging fruit?
Could we have a proposal from you as how do we prioritize that? I would love to see that.
It is, and it comes down to the tools that we're putting in place right now. And the tools, one of the tools is actually looking at the portfolio and doing debt scoring. And saying, okay, based on these characteristics, you have a much greater likelihood of collecting this kind of debt than you would another kind of debt, and your efforts would be more useful spent here than it would be like we're doing right now, which is everything is the same. So we chase a lot of dead ends right now.
Right. And when you're doing that, can we also see the percentage, what our costs are? I mean, as a consumer, and advocating for the consumer, we'd like to see what the costs are to recover. Yes. Sometimes you're spending a lot more than you're actually getting in return, and we've got to be more fiscally responsible. Thank you.
The one thing which I would say on that last point is we're very proud of this statistic, which is for every dollar that we spend on debt collection, we return $53 in collections. That's the efficiency element that we're very proud of, which is a pretty good return.
But you can get better, right?
But we can get better, and that's exactly where I was going to. We can do better than that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kosar, and you earned the extra time by your patience in my late arrival. So I will yield to myself now, and Commissioner, again, appreciate your work and your staff and the serious approach that you're taking. I guess the initial question I have is just when you look at your numbers, and you shared in your testimony where you jumped 7.3% from 09 and 67% over the years back to 05. If you had to point to most significant change or actions that resulted in that 67% jump, what would you reference?
Everyone's playing together now in a way that they were not playing. And maybe that's
meaning departments and agencies, or internally within your department, or across the spectrum of the Federal Government?
I think maybe everyone's hitting stride now. I would just say that we now are getting the payment streams in that should be in. We're getting the debt referrals that we should be getting in. I think that plays a significant role. I also think that the amount of delinquent debt has grown too. So there's an element there of there's more volume to go against. But I also think it really speaks to, this is why I think we're really at a stage to go to another level now. I think that we've got a very strong infrastructure in place to do what we need to do, and now we need to be smarter at what we're doing.
And that goes to Dr. Kosar, going from $52 for one to
yes,
60, 70, right? Sky's the limit, right? We appreciate that you reference a number of specific legislative proposals. Both pretty straightforward, both on the 100% collection, on basically vendor payments, Federal contractors, Medicare providers, and then also to assist with State collection, being able to collect even if the person is now residing outside the State they owe. I guess first question on those proposals is, those aren't new. I know they were in I think the 2011 budget proposal as well. what would be the, and one, I know our committee staff, we've started working with your office on legislative efforts along this, the route of these proposals. What would you say would be the biggest opposition to those proposals? And what have you heard, if anything, for those who don't support either of those?
The legislative process is never easy. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is that we have frequently submitted legislative proposals in multiple years, and they ultimately get done, but they tend to get done over time. I really would be surprised if there would be a lot of opposition to either of those two, except from those who are delinquent on their Medicare or contractor obligations, because they do make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I agree. And again, we look forward to working with you and your office on trying to speed up that legislative process a little bit. And in the 2011 budget proposal, there were some additional legislative proposals, and I don't believe they were accomplished yet, at least not all. And do you want to highlight any of those additional proposals that we should have on our radar, in addition to the ones specifically in the 2012 proposal?
One of the things is dealing with incentives, and I think for the most part right now, when a debt is delinquent and we collect on it, the fee that's attached to that, whether it be from the private collection agency or the fee that we charge, is added on to the debt. There is an incentive, a negative incentive for Medicare debt, in which that fee is not legally eligible to be taken, added onto the debt, and therefore either has to be absorbed by the trust fund or by the appropriated monies from the agency. That's a real negative incentive for referring debts. And I think that
for Medicare,
yeah,
referring it,
yes,
to you because of the
yes,
cost to Medicare, since they can't recoup it.
that's right.
Okay.
And that would be one. I think other than that, we've made some progress on some of those other ones. I think some of the other ones have actually moved through several committees, and we're hoping that they will come to a conclusion in this session.
On the fee that is, what type of fee or amount roughly? Is it a percentage of the debt?
There are two fees that potentially could be attached to that. One would be our offset fee, which is the roughly $17 per offset. The other fee is, if we refer it to a private collection agency, the fee is usually around 28% or so on that.
And that's what is being paid to once you get to a PCA?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. That's and we on most other debts, we add that on to the debt. So if there's a $100 debt, it becomes a $128 debt, and the debtor is the one bearing the responsibility. On Medicare debts, presently, that's not the case.
Okay. Get one more question here, and go to another round for members if they like. On administrative wage garnishment, in your testimony, you talk about the 25 agencies that are participating now, and you continue to work with non-participating agencies to encourage. I guess my question is, why isn't everyone participating? Why aren't they taking advantage of this opportunity to collect what's owed their agency, the American people?
This is one of those areas where, as we've gotten more mature in the Debt Collection Improvement Act, it's clear that there are barriers for the agencies to do their work. Administrative wage garnishment has there's a sense, right or wrong, that you need to go to a court in order to get that garnishment. One of the things the DCIA said that the Federal Government can do an administrative wage garnishment without a court. Now, you have to allow a hearing if someone wants to appeal the amount owed or whether their ability to pay. That has turned out to be a barrier to the agencies, that they don't want to, they're either, it's not part of their core mission. They're not going to want to set up hearings like that, and they're uncomfortable with the administrative wage garnishment process. So,
and that hearing process is individual to every agency?
Yes, it is. It is. And so one of the things that we're looking at FMS is whether we should be providing that as a centralized service to remove that barrier to use of administrative wage garnishment. I think Chairman Horma was looking at the record, said that, from his perspective, any debtor who had an income stream should be subject to some sort of agreement before they're made a payment by the Federal Government. And when he was talking about the administrative wage garnishment provision, And I think there's a lot of validity to that, that we should be doing more as a federal government. The other thing what's happened right now is that we have left administrative wage garnishment with each agency, so they have to put a regulation in place in order to do the program, which we've given them a model language and we provide it to them, and they can, it's something that's fairly easy for them to do, but nevertheless it's a hurdle. So I think that our ability to provide more of a centralized service, and this is something which is an area that's worth exploring more fully.
Yeah, and I would encourage that, because it would make sense, because it's going to vary by some agencies like Department of Ed having a lot of debt, that they're relating, may relate to student loans.
Yes.
But another smaller department or agency having a small amount of debt, or not that often, perhaps, to have their own administrative hearing process versus a centralized. I think that is something where Treasury could play an important role, and that we get everybody participating.
And there's a second piece on that we've found in our own dealings is that if a file doesn't have good information in it, it's hard for the agency to track that information down. So if you're looking for a good phone number, you're looking for a good address, and one of the areas where we think we can provide a more centralized service is providing that service to agencies, saying if you're looking for a debtor, you can run it through our process so that you can find that person, get a phone number, get the information that you need in order to move forward more efficiently.
Yeah, and having just sat through the hearing with GAO on the duplicative programs that the Federal Government has from last week at the full committee, I think it's a good example. Whenever we can eliminate administrative overhead by eliminate duplication, we want to, and these are areas I think would be very helpful. So, Mr. Towns, do you have other questions?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. Just thinking in terms of the Social Security overpayment, I guess the first thing, would you need additional legislation to support above and beyond what you've already proposed? And the reason I ask that question, why couldn't we ask the undertaker to give the Social Security number when the person expires?
Social Security does maintain a death database or a post-death database.
How does that work?
I'm not familiar, although what I want to get, I do know that they did look at the exact proposal that you were referencing, and that is, should the funeral homes be required to submit the data to a database? And they did a pilot a couple years ago in which they actually paid the funeral homes for the information every time they submitted the information. I think what they found in that point was that they didn't have the money to continue with that, and that if, in fact, it was required, you could have a more, so getting to your point, you could have a much better database, a more perfect database, which would go a long way toward avoiding those payments to someone who shouldn't be getting it. And so I think it's an area that deserves further attention.
Yeah, because I think just leaving it to the family, to report, I'm not sure that's going to work. To be able to cut down on the overpayments, right. I'm sure.
And I just also, to clarify one other point, the financial institutions also report back into the system as well when someone has been deceased. So if they're aware of the information from a bank, it will come back in as well.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The other thing is that you mentioned state-of-the-art tools. What do you mean by state-of-the-art tools?
There's much more. The private sector has done a lot more with segmentation of the portfolio, different mechanisms and tools that are more effective than others of how you actually reach certain debtors. But also more, I think, to the point is that business intelligence tools and looking at databases and mining those databases for certain characteristics is an area that the private sector is doing a lot more of than what we are doing in the Federal Government. It's an area which I think has a lot of opportunity for us to be doing better. So it's really looking at these databases and looking at lots of different data and saying there are certain debtors here with certain characteristics that would lead us to believe that we have more collectability on one kind of debt or another. It's also those automated tools I mentioned to you before about when a debt comes in and the information may not be perfect. Can you, in a highly automated way, clean that data up more effectively about addresses and phone numbers and those kinds of things within the file? And the private sector is much more advanced. I would also say that with respect to our working in the cross-servicing side, that we should be more systematic in scripts that we're using, so that when a collector is working a list of debts, that they're given the information in an automated fashion, so when the automated phone call is made or the automated outreach is made, that they have, based on that debt, they have scripts that they're using to be more efficient in how they're collecting the debt, so they're not spending 10 minutes on a debt when they really, that the better way would be to spend 1 minute on that debt, if they're more concise and disciplined in that approach. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at in terms of our call centers and our opportunity to collect debt and those state-of-the-art tools.
Do you need additional legislative support, above and beyond what has been proposed? Do you need additional?
For the moment, I would say no. And I do think, however, that that as we pass the 15th anniversary of the Debt Collection Improvement Act, that there is opportunities for us to discuss whether there is more that can be done more generally. So we don't have anything more than what we have in the 12 budget, but we're always looking into the 13 budget, and we're looking beyond about other ways that we might be able to have other pieces of legislation that would help us. And we're happy to work with the committee on that.
Right. Thank you very much. On that note, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. No. Ms. Norton, did you have any questions for the witness? Not at the moment. Okay, thank you. I've got a long list, so I'll yield back to myself. On the reciprocal arrangements with states, and you referenced Kentucky and being the newest one, and how quickly they reap the benefits of participating. I wanted to make sure I understood the process. States that are beyond the 4 that are currently signed up, are we still collecting debts for any that are not signed up to help us collect Federal debt?
Our terminology gets complicated, but we are actually collecting state income tax debt for states, for a lot of states, more than those 4. So we do have, on the state income tax side, there is work that's being done for when a Federal income tax payment is made, that it can be offset and given back to a state. The state reciprocal program gets a little bit more narrow and allows, it broadens what we can, it broadens the types of payments that we can offset. So we include vendor payments at that point, so that the state can participate that way. And vice versa, we actually collect debts from the states. We collect in from the states when they're making payments. So it's reciprocal. We both get benefits from the arrangement.
Once they're participating in that program.
Yes, they are.
Currently, though, there are states that were collecting state tax, income tax owed.
Yes.
And sending it back. I'll use Pennsylvania, my home state. But Pennsylvania is not collecting Federal income tax owed to us from any payments they're making.
Right now, I think that we did do a test run with Pennsylvania and found that if they were participating in the state reciprocal program using vendor payments, I think that they could collect additional $29 to $30 million a year based on that program. I do believe, and my staff can correct me if I'm wrong, though, that we are actually we're doing offset on tax information with the State of Pennsylvania right now, and I don't know what that number is in terms of what's been sent back that way.
But I guess what I'm focused on is if we're helping states out, whether they're in the reciprocal program or not,
Yes.
with their state income tax, it sounds like we're still helping them.
Yes.
Collect state income tax, even if they're not helping us collect Federal income tax.
I believe that's correct. They can correct me if I've got that wrong.
They're shaking their heads, yes, that I have it right.
Good. Okay. Good.
I think.
Yes. IRS does that. Correct.
Yeah.
I would say that on the state reciprocal last year, I think of the 2 states that were participating at that time, I think that we sent $16 million in their direction, and they sent $12 million in our direction. So that was.
Yeah. I think getting all the states participating would be great, and if they don't want to, then they need to understand, I guess what I'm getting after is that we're not going to keep helping to collect state debt
Right.
if they're not going to help collect Federal debt.
Right.
So they have an incentive to be part of the program.
Yes.
And I don't know within the Department if you have that authority to send that message, or if that's something we need to look at legislatively and saying, hey, hey, that you can go to the state saying, as of a year from now, we're not going to be able to help you unless you help us, and something maybe we want to look at. On the things, I guess certain types of debt that are exempt from participating top or the cross-servicing, I noticed one of them is debts owed by foreign sovereigns. Can you expand on that, and what type of debt would be owed us by a foreign sovereign, and what type of payment will we be making that we couldn't then attach even though they owe us money?
I'll have to get back to you on that one. I don't know the nature of the debts that are in there.
Yeah, I just, our focus is about, Americans that owe, a debt, and we're trying to collect it. Well, if there are foreign entities that owe America a debt, they shouldn't be getting a payment from us for something else, in my opinion. And so if we could look into that a little deeper, that would be great.
Okay.
Let me catch up in my notes here. Mistake when I get the testimony ahead of time, it gives me lots of time to review and make notes in my blue pens. On the issue of debts that are not going to be written off, how do you go about, and it's kind of addressed a little bit earlier, but in determining, I mean, obviously some, death, the person's deceased, the debt is not going to be collected. But in other ones where you reference financial hardship or other reasons, how do you assess that to say, hey, no, we're going to give up, and as Mr. Towns referenced, 2 years versus, hey, we're going to keep it, and 4 years from now, hey, that person who's having hardship might be in the money now, and hey, we still want them to pay what they owe.
We rely heavily on the program agency to make that determination, in part because, in large measure because they're more familiar with the program characteristics, and as well as the debt is actually on the agency's books. So they're the ones who are ultimately responsible for the debt.
Okay.
So we have not spent a lot of, we don't really get behind what those decisions are, other than that we know that they're usually based on bankruptcy or the entity no longer existing.
Give me 1 second here. On the report that was submitted about your debt collection efforts, in there it references in the executive summary that you're in essence reporting what the head of each federal agency provides you to then compile in essence and then forward to Congress. Are there agencies that are not complying and not providing their debt collection effort information to you?
The good news is we feel pretty good that we're getting most of the debts that are referred to us. I think it's hard for us to say that we're getting 100%, because every now and then we learn about some part of a program that's not being referred to us. Our agency council that we're establishing, that's one of the areas where we want to make sure that we're working with agencies more closely to make sure we understand that they really are referring all the debts that they should be referring to us. But as I said, that it's one of the great success stories of DCIA is that in the early years it was very difficult to get the referrals to us. For a variety of reasons, whether the debts were in the right format, whether they were documented the right way, whether we had the automated systems in which to transfer information. And we've really made a lot of progress in that area. I wish I could say I could say with complete confidence that we're getting 100%. I know we're doing pretty well. We're up in the high 90s. I can say that with some degree of confidence. But whether we're getting every single one, I think there's some more work that we can do on that.
But I'll wrap up, and then if Ms. Norton, I'll yield in just one moment. As you're working with departments and agencies, if they are reticent for whatever reason to cooperate and participate, and either in being more proactive on the wage garnishment or just in providing the information in a timely manner to you to pursue, this subcommittee certainly stands ready to bring some added leverage to your efforts. I know you're, as a department, kind of a peer department or agency to many of these entities. But sometimes just the fact that the subcommittee is interested in looking at a certain agency that they're not fully going after debt as they should be, we're glad to do that. And again, in a partnership way, that we just want to make sure we're all on the same page and doing. You know, probably maybe not the only, but one of the few that paid my last student loan to the Federal Government, as a member of Congress, and took 11 years. But my wife and I didn't miss those payments because it was our debt, and we were glad to fulfill it, and it allowed us to advance ourselves. So we expect others to fill their obligations as well. So with that, I'll yield to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you weren't glad to fulfill it, but you knew that it was your duty to fulfill it.
Actually, I was glad to fulfill it so I could get it off the books and start putting that money towards my kids' education in the years to come.
No, he knew we were going to have a hearing.
I have a question about doctors and Medicare. There had been a doctor who was delinquent, and I need to know what delinquent means, in federal tax obligations, could have 15% of the payments withheld. And now there is a proposal in the 2012 budget for 100%. Now, for first blush, that seems par for the course. They're doctors; they ought to be able to pay their taxes. On the other hand, there is huge concern in the Congress about the rapid attrition of physicians even willing to see Medicare patients. So I'm obliged to ask you what your view is of this 100%. That would include Medicare, apparently all contractors. And again, on the face of it, the fairness of it is clear. But what do you think that would do for doctors who, in fact, are seeing Medicare patients, getting, they will tell you a few cents on the dollar, getting very little, very little of what they believe they are entitled to, and they will only point to what, in fact, they can get if they jettison Medicare and take only people who are willing to come without Medicare, so much so that some elderly are willing in order to keep their physicians when they jettison Medicare, to pay for the entire amount themselves. So there will be many elderly who could not. What effect would this 100% levy? First of all, what does delinquent mean? Do you think that the 2012 budget legislative proposal is in effect now, because it's a legislative proposal? I don't know if it's in the appropriation or what. The word delinquent is not clear to me. Would you explain how this would operate? I'm particularly interested in Medicare doctors. I understand why they would be folded in with other contractors, but I'd like to know what delinquency would in fact result in this 100%, and what effect you think it would have on Medicare providers willing to continue to provide Medicare to the elderly.
Thank you. We're very supportive of the proposal. It would yield close to $750 million over the 10-year period, which is a sizable amount. With respect to the underlying program issues, as
why was it at 15%? That didn't work. Did the 15%, which does seem to be a fairly low amount, why was the number increased from 15% to 100%?
I suspect it has to do with the $750 million over 10 years.
Somebody
which was,
wanted the money.
Which is the ability to collect the money sooner.
It was coming in too slowly, okay.
Yeah. With respect to delinquency, agencies and debtors have due process rights. So to the extent that a Medicare provider has a delinquency, they would be notified and have the ability to either have a hearing or some sort of discussion about whether that's the appropriate amount in which they're being charged. They also have, in most cases, the ability to say whether there's financial hardship, whether the ability to repay, and whether there's other repayment agreements that they can get into along to satisfy that delinquency.
So even with this 100%, do you believe a physician could in fact work out something with the IRS the way the average citizen does to pay a certain percentage, or would he nevertheless, because he is, quote, delinquent, have to abide by the 100%?
When we go through, at FMS, for example, when these debts are referred to us, we do oftentimes have compromise authority in which we work with the agencies to say, is there a better way to collect this debt? Is there a more reasonable way to have either repayment agreements or some sort of mechanism to make sure that we have better collectability? And that's always the process, has to be working with the debtor to do that. With respect to the impact on the program, one of the things which we don't have a lot of expertise in because there are so many programs out there is the underlying purpose of a program and the underwriting standards that are given. So why a payment is made under what circumstances is not something that we at FMS or Treasury would have a very good feel for.
Would a delinquent, let's say, physician be one who had simply ignored the opportunity after a hearing to work out something for himself and finally gets on this list? The only way you can get the money is to get on this list to get 100% from you.
Yes. And so when the debt is referred to us at 180 days, we will do a variety of things. We will then do a process of our own in terms of contacting the debtor and making sure that they know that they're either going to...
So he gets another chance to...
There's another chance on it, yes. And then we would be working with the agency, agency to say, is this the right thing to be doing in this particular circumstance? Once it's with us...
I take it, since this was this is in fact the law now. Is that the fact?
The 15% is the law right now.
No, the 100%. When does that become effective?
If the legislation passes.
So this is. It says this is not yet law.
It is proposed legislation.
But you all strongly support it.
Yes, we do.
The administration strongly supports it.
Yes.
Have there been hearings?
I don't believe there has been.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. The effort in helping to move this legislation is something that we're very involved with and want to help make happen. And I think, and I apologize, didn't hear all the answer because of conversation here, but when we talk about Medicare providers, a type of debt that we're talking about, and you may have referenced this, and I apologize, is the story where you have a doctor who got student loans, paid their way through school with the help of American taxpayers, is out, making a good or whatever income, but is not paying back those loans. Once that's discovered, Medicare can say, all right, you're getting paid by the taxpayers. We're going to take some of that to pay off that debt you owe. That would be an example of a delinquent debt that a doctor has. It's not related to their medical provision of services. It's related to the education they got.
Correct. Or will it be tax debt?
Yeah.
In the case of a delinquent tax debt, correct.
Okay.
Yes.
We're going to, Mr. Towns, did you have anything else?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Just a quick one. We want to be helpful. I want you to know that, in every way. But, I didn't feel comfortable with your answer in reference to if a person moves from one state to another in terms of the collection process. I didn't feel comfortable with your answer. Help me.
Okay. Well, right now, there's a lot of what happens is that we don't have the ability that if you incur a debt in one state and then you move to another state, because of certain restrictions, we no longer can actually pursue that debt, or the state can no longer pursue that debt against someone who's moved from, let's say, Pennsylvania to New York. And so the provision that we're asking for is that you can, in fact, continue to pursue that person if they move to another jurisdiction.
And the last part of that is that, in some instances, people might not have the resources to pay at a given point, but then at a later date, they come into a lot of money or something. How do you deal with that?
That's one of the reasons why very few debts are extinguished in our process, and why they stay in the database for a long period of time and will continue to be worked for a long period of time. We do actually, and with respect to debtors who are under financial hardship, we do try to work out repayment agreements. We do try to make sure that we put terms in there. As I mentioned on the cross-servicing, close to $500 million of repayment agreements are in there. Administrative wage garnishment orders are in there to allow us to collect that debt over a period of time. And administrative wage garnishment is a 15%. So you're not garnishing someone's entire wages. You're garnishing a percentage that allows us to collect small pieces of that debt until it's satisfied.
Thank you. We're going to keep the record open for 7 days, and I know two specific issues, one with the defense debt that Mr. Towns referenced, and then my inquiry on the foreign sovereigns and what type of debt we'd be talking there versus payments that we're making to these foreign sovereigns, and if there is any other materials that you think would be relevant. Conclude with, one, again, an appreciation for your patience and my colleagues' patience with my late arrival, and then especially our interest and willingness to partner with you and your agency in really improving the process to make sure that what's owed the American people is paid, and that we make sure you have the tools to be able to do that. So,
thank you for your leadership, and thank you for allowing us to testify today.
No, thanks for being here. And again, hearing the record will be open for 7 days, and this hearing stands adjourned.
Thank you.
So, Commissioner lebryk is Commissioner of the United States Department of the Treasury's Financial Management Service. As Commissioner, he provides leadership, policy direction, and guidance for financial management programs, including payments, collections, debt collection, and government-wide accounting and financial reporting. Commissioner lebryk, I appreciate you submitting your written testimony here today, and have had a chance to review that as well as the report, and also appreciated your reference to our joint predecessor for former Chairman Towns and myself in referencing Chairman Horn. It was quite an honor to serve with him when I first came to Congress in 2000, and he was a great leader of this subcommittee as well as on a number of efforts, as you referenced in your statement. As the author of the Debt Collection Improvement Act, Chairman Horn certainly worked tirelessly on this issue that we're going to talk about here today, and certainly honored to follow in his footsteps and continuing his efforts in partnering with you and my colleagues. Also want to thank you for your service in general. As one who believes in the ideals of public service, appreciate what you give back to our country and our fellow citizens. Ranking Member and I look forward to working with you, along with our subcommittee colleagues, and being partners in this important effort achieving accountability for the American people. Now recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Towns from New York, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for arranging this hearing. As this Congress continues to debate the nation's budget, we are looking to identify sensible cost-cutting measures and ways to increase revenue to the Federal Government. This hearing considers the collection of debt owed to the government, which is an important revenue stream in these tough economic times. I thank the Chairman for holding this hearing. Collection of Federal Government and State debt is an essential way to help fund government operations, maintain key programs, and help reduce the Federal deficit. It is also an extremely effective method of collecting delinquent child support obligations to help meet the needs of the children who depend on that support. In the years since this subcommittee began examining debt collection, there has been great improvement. The Treasury Department has taken the tools that the Congress provided in the Debt Collection Improvement Act of 1996 and has expanded its reach to increase the volume of delinquent debt in the government recoups. From 1996 to the end of FY 2010, Financial Management and Services has collected more than $49.7 billion for Federal and State agencies. This is a commendable result compared to the collection level before 1996. Treasury continues to improve its offset and cross-servicing programs. FMS has ramped up its efforts in collecting delinquent tax and non-tax debt owed by Federal employees. The doctors and hospitals who receive Medicare payments and Federal contractors, they are working on identifying other payments that the government can target for collection. There is more than $625 billion in outstanding debts to the government. We are actively collecting $422 billion of that balance. In FY 2010, we actually recovered $5.3 billion. It is clear, Mr. Chairman, that there is much more work that needs to be done. And I'm looking forward to the testimony today of our witness. And, of course, as a result of this, I hope we can continue to move forward as we've done over the last few years. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time. I'm anxious and eager to hear from our witness.
Thank you, Mr. Towns. We'll now proceed to Commissioner lebryk. And, Commissioner, as the kind of the practice and rules of the House, we swear in every witness. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Government Organization, Efficiency, and Financial Management will come to order. First, I want to apologize to my colleagues, our witness, and others for the delay in starting. Typically have about an hour and 45-minute commute. And today was about 2:40, maybe 2:45, and thankfully, hope all the individuals who were in the accidents that I passed are safe, and glad I was not in them, but apologize for keeping you waiting. But we are glad to be here today for this important oversight hearing. I want to thank our witness for being here today to discuss efforts to collect delinquent debt owed to the Federal Government. While this is certainly a financial management issue, it also is an accountability issue. Part of accountability is making sure that people fulfill their obligations, whether those obligations are to pay a fine, a penalty, or to repay a Federal loan, or to pay child support. Each and every day, the people of Treasury's Debt Management Service do all they can to demand accountability while being sensitive to the rights and circumstances of debtors. This hearing coincides with the release of the fiscal year 2010 Annual Debt Report, which provides a detailed look at Treasury's activities. We look forward to discussing that report as well as some of the proposals in the President's budget. We are honored here today to have Mr. David lebryk with, if I could ask you to stand and raise your right hand. Do solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. So the clerk will note that the witness answered in the affirmative, and would like you to proceed. We have 7 minutes on the clock, but if you need a little more as the only witness, we're certainly glad to give you some additional time.
I'll try to stay within that time frame. Chairman, thank you. Chairman Platts, Ranking Member Towns, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on something which we take very seriously, and that's the collection of delinquent debt owed to the Federal Government. I ask that my entire statement be read into the record. Thank you. Congressman Horn was a tremendous champion of the Debt Collection Improvement Act in 1996, and so I wanted to spend a moment and pay our respects to him for the efforts that he did. We had a lot of spirited conversations with Chairman Horn during those early years, and we all shared a very common objective, and that was to make sure we were doing the best interest of the American taxpayer. He was really quite a champion of this act and the work that we're doing at FMS, and we're very much appreciative of that. This marks the 15th anniversary of the Debt Collection Improvement Act, and a lot has been accomplished in that time. I want to thank you again for holding this hearing to demonstrate Congress's interest in the Federal Government's activities. I also want to commend the leadership of you, Chairman Platts and Mr. Towns, for your interest in our